So back in 2004, my immediate and extended family gathered just outside Glacier National Park in Montana, the state where I grew up. And the occasion was my father had a brief break during the first of 3 year-long military tours serving in Iraq. And as the family was gathering around asking him questions that we couldn't even fathom, what's it like over there? None of us had been to the Middle East. I was surprised that a lot of the attention was then turned to me. I was in my junior year of college, and they were equally interested in my very exotic and foreign experience, being the first person in my family to go to college. So as I was explaining these courses, I was taking medieval literature and religious studies. The Crusades came up, and my father interrupted me and said, "Hey, maybe you can answer this. Why are the Iraqis always wanting to talk to me about the Crusades? From shopkeepers to military commanders, they come up again and again." And I had to say, I have absolutely no idea. The medieval Crusades were more than 500 miles from Iraq. Not to mention, in 2004, you would think there are more important things on their mind than the medieval Crusades. But the question stuck with me, and then I started what ended up being a 10-year project of gathering all the instances of references of the Crusades used in the US and the Middle East after 9/11 to ask, why are we talking about the Crusades at this moment in time? So to give you some examples of the things that I looked at, most famously, George W. Bush, just a few days after 9/11, referred to the impending war on terror as a crusade, and there was a big backlash among the media, especially in the Middle East. Of course, he was echoing the same rhetorical statement that Osama bin Laden had been making for over 15 years beforehand, calling Israelis and the US and Westerners generally crusaders. Outside of the political arena, after 9/11, there were a bunch of really popular representations of the Crusade. Ridley Scott's blockbuster film Kingdom of Heaven came out, and what was more interesting for me, a number of pieces of literature like the Da Vinci Code, Don DeLillo's Falling Man, that aren't set at all in the medieval period, they're set in the present, but their plot brings in the Crusades, Templars, and Crusader elements to understand the present. So especially Don DeLillo's Falling Man, it takes place just days after 9/11 in New York City, and the characters are constantly referencing the Crusades, looking at a painting, and it makes them think of the Crusades. There's also a big boom in popular histories of the Crusades. This is Rodney Stark's God's Battalion, A Case for the Crusades, where he says, well, you know what, the medieval Crusades were really about Europeans protecting themselves against the Muslim threat, the cultural threat of having Islam in Europe. We might be having the same sort of threat today. Picked up, unfortunately, and more popularly, in the Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for 16 weeks. Both of these texts were cited by Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik in his manifesto, which he published online just before shooting dozens of Norwegians, calling himself a contemporary crusader, protecting Europe against the Muslim invasion. These sort of terrorist threats were then picked up by the US national intelligence agencies through software that they built called A-Space, sort of MySpace for analysts, who were dealing with a bunch of interviews and surveillance of people, and it allowed the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, through word searches to compare notes and say, oh, a lot of the guys you're tracking keep referencing the Crusades. A lot of the guys I'm tracking are referencing the Crusades. Maybe we should flag this as historical rhetoric that might be being used to promote violence. The weird gets weirder. I ended up finding out that, in fact, Saddam Hussein was obsessed with the Crusades. For 15 years before the US-led invasion, he had a huge propaganda machine. This is a book, a children's book that he had published where he calls himself Saladin II. Saladin was the major Muslim foe to Richard the Lionheart. In fact, they were both born in Tikrit. Forget the fact, conveniently, that Saladin was a Kurd. But Saddam actually changed his birth certificate so that he was born exactly 800 days after Saladin. And in this book, he calls himself Saladin II. Because there was so many representations like this, I found surprising things like interpretations of the Abu Ghraib torture photographs as evidence by Iraqis that this was in fact a crusade, taking up the notion that Saddam had spread that has historical documentation that the Crusaders tortured a number of Muslims during the Crusades. They said, well, if that happened during the Crusades and Americans are torturing today, this is evidence that this is in fact a crusade. And last but not least, National Geographic and IBM in the early 2000s formed a collaboration called the Genographic Project, trying to trace genetic ancestry across the globe. Their very first site was in Lebanon, and they sampled Y chromosomes of Lebanese and Syrian men and found a marker that they called the Crusader gene, and then delivered results to a number of people in the Levant saying, your ancestors were Crusaders, your ancestors were Phoenicians, and your ancestors were Crusaders. So of course this is all fascinating, but what do you do with this? Especially things that should be done by political scientists or historians or literature scholars. How can I look at all of these things and say there's a larger story here and put them together? So when I first started graduate work, I did my first master's in media studies, really interested in the fact that a lot of these narratives, like Da Vinci Code, are in a novel or in a film. The narrative is the same, but your engagement with that narrative is going to change based on the media. I was then fortunate enough to receive a Rhodes Scholarship, which sent me to Oxford for 2 years. So I did another couple masters, one in medieval literature, focusing on the Crusades, because I'm going to learn about the Crusades, I should know something. And then a third master's in anthropology, focusing on anthropology of the Middle East, and also this field called historical memory, assessing how societies and cultures view the past, and how that informs their perception of the present, decision-making in the present, and then how they imagine different futures. How to turn this into a PhD was a puzzle. I applied to one program and made explicit in my application, you're my only hope. And it was Stanford's interdisciplinary program in modern thought and literature. Traditionally, it has students that are blending humanities and social sciences, but what it allowed me to do over 7 years was work with faculty in media and communications, departments of comparative literature, history education, anthropology, biomedical ethics, experts across campus that were interested in my project and helped me contextualize all of this. So a large part of my research was archival. It just happens that Stanford's great resources, like the Hoover Institute, helped me out. Looking at all of these different artifacts and asking who made them, why did they make them? Within these mediated representations themselves, what are the different narrative tropes or the rhetorical strategies that they're employing to use the Crusades for some purpose? Then I was really interested in reception. So a lot of my research then would do things like qualitatively code thousands of reviews of these history books from places like Amazon.com and Goodreads to see why were people buying these books in the first place, what did they find interesting, and at the end of reading, what did they then do? Were reviewers saying, well, then I read this book, or it made me change my mind in this way, or it makes me want to vote for Bush, or not vote for Bush, etc. And then, of course, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. In particular, I did 10 months of direct participant observation in Lebanon at this Foundation Genographic Project lab, where I could actually ask the scientists, why are you asking these questions? Why the Crusades? Why are you interpreting this data as Crusader DNA? And then actually see people showing up to the lab, holding their forearm out and saying, take my blood and tell me who I am. And seeing if they were Christian, Muslim, or Druze, wanting the Crusader gene or definitely not wanting the Crusader gene. In the end, my dissertation ended up binding these things through 3 different animating concepts. The first being the notion of metaphor. A lot of this isn't really paid attention to because it's viewed as conspiracy or just historically inaccurate. A conservative historian will say, well, the Iraq War is not a crusade. Yes, literally it's not a crusade. But it is a metaphor, and when someone says the Iraq War is like a crusade or is a crusade, and ever since the advent of natural language, metaphorical thinking is one of the ways that we make sense of the world. We know these two things are not identical. That's why we're comparing them. The other thing that I mentioned was medium, really paying attention to how the different affordances or restraints or the ability for consumers or audiences to engage with the media change their relationship to these representations. And the final concept was agency. This is where I was really interested in the reception data. After watching the Da Vinci Code or reading this history textbook or getting this genetic study, what did people think that they could think about, do, say in the world after encountering these. Everything from terrorists viewing the Abu Ghraib photographs and saying, because these are Crusades, I'm not going to engage in terrorist activity, to conflict resolution groups consuming this information and saying, actually, I'm interpreting this as the moment to say we need to stop this cycle, this so-called clash of civilizations. And I'll end by saying the work I'm doing now in the Poetic Media Lab is really exciting to me because I get to design technologies that help me answer some of the puzzles that I couldn't really solve in my dissertation, namely things like reception of a novel. A novel takes a long time to read, multiple hours over multiple nights. You can't really sit and watch someone read without being super creepy. So some of these technologies then have participants read online, and through digital annotation and highlight, I can see what interested them, why did it interest them, and I can get their feedback and ask things like, how is metaphorical or figurative language animating these different representations? It also then allows me to bridge my social scientific background and produce data and platforms for humanists in this field of digital humanities to show them that the questions they've been asking forever actually have data behind them if you just imagine it as data. So I'll end finally by saying, I hope I've conveyed how grateful I've been to have this program that would take on an interdisciplinary weirdo like myself. It's been a fantastic journey at Stanford. I'm really excited to continue this research, and thank you all for listening.